I'm so excited for this video because we finally get to start working on our quilts. It's the whole reason we're here, and I'm so excited to get started. So by now you should have your layer cake, a reliable sewing machine, and all of the tools we talked about several videos ago. You should also have a tidy space picked out in your home, maybe a kitchen table or a folding table maybe in your living room. You might even have a whole room dedicated to sewing. Wherever you end up putting your sewing stuff, make sure that whoever you live with knows to leave your equipment and fabric alone. Based on my own personal experience, you're going to need to hide those scissors. People want to take your scissors and they'll use them on the worst things and they'll make them dull. So your fabric scissors need to be just for fabric. So quick reminder, your layer cake is a stack of pre-cut 10-inch squares, and there should be 42 of them. Hopefully your layer cake is going to be nice and flat when you open it up, and we can get straight to cutting. But if there are wrinkles or folds, or it just isn't quite as flat as you want it to be, you're going to want to press before you start cutting. For instance, Ruby Star Society layer cakes are usually rolled up, so they are probably going to need to press. And notice I said press and not iron. So instead of pushing down on your fabric and then pushing out towards the edges with force, we're going to gently put down the iron, and when we want to move, we pick it up and move it. When you're new to the process, I recommend you do the exaggerated motion to just get used to that lift and shift. But when I do it, I'll set my iron down, and when I'm ready to move it, I barely lift it up, and I'll shift it over, and then I'll let the weight of the iron go down, and then I'll just barely pick it up, and it almost looks like I'm not doing it at all. Just like that, real delicate. So rest the iron gently, pick it up ever so slightly, and move on. The important thing is that you're not ironing your squares out of shape. If I'm pressing fabric the size of a fat quarter or larger, I will use Mary Ellen's Best Press. It's sort of like starch, but not quite as strong. It just helps make your fabric a little bit more manageable. It's especially useful when you're piecing really small pieces, or you need to be extra precise. Some people also use this starch spray, and they can spray it really lightly. Some people absolutely drench their fabric with this, and that's all fine for larger pieces of fabric, but when you use the spray starches, or you use Mary Ellen's Best Press, or even with steam, you can get a little bit of shrinkage to your fabric. And the amount of shrinkage can actually differ from one piece of fabric to another. So we want every piece of our fabric we are using to stay exactly 10 inches square. So please don't steam or starch or best press your fabric. We're going to go au naturel on this, okay? You've probably noticed these funny little zigzags all around the edges of your fabric. They're called pinked edges. They use pinking shears usually to do this. There are some pinking rotary blades you can get. This edge is entirely practical and not at all decorative. It is actually to help prevent your fabric from fraying. There can be differences in layer cakes based on who prepared them. So I've seen some that don't have pink edges and they look very messy. There's all sorts of shaggy threads everywhere and a lot of peeling and crumbs everywhere. So one thing to keep in mind when you're measuring with these pinked edges is to imagine the pinked edges as a solid line that stretches from one tip all the way down to another. I'm going to flash the quilt block patterns up on the screen now, so you can take a screenshot if you're on a device, take a picture if you're watching on a TV, or you can purchase a simple little PDF pattern from my merch shop. It isn't a full standard pattern. It has cutting instructions and general information and quilt layout instructions, but there are no step-by-step guides because I'll be covering that in this video series. We'll be making 20 blocks total, which is going to use up 40 of the 42 squares in our layer cake, and we'll be making 5 blocks of each block pattern. Most quilts are assembled row by row, and then you sew those rows together. But that means you would have to match up each of these intersections in order to carry on that straight line. And if you're just a little bit off, you can really see when you've messed up if you do it row by row. So instead for this quilt, we're going to piece them column by column, okay? So it's the same general idea. You piece them all in a column like this, but then when you sew them together, because of the nature of this pattern, it's going to be really hard to see if you're off in your intersections. It's going to look more purposeful. I did this on purpose because I wanted to set you guys up for success. So this eliminates the need for you to perfectly match these seams, but I would like you to try to match the seams because that's an important skill that you'll need later on down the line. So again, it is not absolutely necessary for this quilt pattern, but matching seams is a core fundamental skill for quilting. So if you work on it here in this pattern where it's a low stress situation, it should come a little bit easier when it's more important to match your seams later on. I'm going to be showing you exactly how I make my quilt, but there is always a lot of leeway for you to choose your own path. From how you want to sort your fabric to how you want to arrange your blocks and how you want to quilt your quilt and how you want to finish your quilt. All of that is going to be up to your specific preferences. There's no obligation for you to do it exactly as I'm going to be doing it. And I'm going to try to show you along the way different little variations you can try out if you don't like what I'm doing. I'm going to arrange my fabric into light and dark, then I'm going to split it in half, and I'm going to pair up the darkest darks with the darkest lights and the mediums with the lightest lights, if that makes sense. I've matched up all of my fabrics. I've got darks matched with lights, like that. So there's good contrast between the two in the block. There's that one. And it just goes like that on down the line. So lights with darks, mostly, mediums with lights, that kind of thing. I'm going to take the first pair of fabrics off the stack and put the rest of them away for now because we're just going to work on block 1. I'm going to be talking about cutting accurately because it is a good thing to practice for quilting in general, but for this quilt specifically, if you're off by a 1/4 inch or so, it won't mess up the quilt pattern, although it is important that no strip ends up under 1 inch wide. So let's say I'm making my very first cut, and I'm supposed to make an 1.5 inch cut, but I get off and I accidentally do 1 3/4 inches. It's not a super huge deal. The pattern should still be fine as long as your strips down the line don't become smaller than 1 inch. So if I cut an extra 1/4 inch here and an extra 1/4 inch here, an extra 1/2 inch here, and then I end up with a strip that's less than 1 inch, that's not ideal. That's not going to help us. So if you're worried about making those kinds of cutting mistakes, I would say start with your thinnest strips first and then cut wider as you go. So for instance, on block 1, there's a 1.5 inch strip. I might cut that one first and then move on to 2 inches and then 3 and then 3.5. You do, however, want to make sure that you're being very careful with how you cut your parallel lines. You want to be as close to parallel as humanly possible, because if you start to get off and you have it thicker down here and more narrow up here, when you sew your strips together, your block is going to be wonky. It's not going to have the straight sides that you want. It might lean or it might waver. So your measurements are okay if they're a little bit off, but you want your sides to be as parallel as possible. To get your most accurate cuts, you're going to want to use the lines on your ruler and not the lines on your cutting mat. And this is for a couple different reasons. First of all, it's easier to see if your lines are off with a ruler because your ruler is sitting on top of the fabric. So you can see right away, but it's peeking over that line, even if it's just a little bit. But if you're using the lines on your cutting mat, it might be a little harder to see that while it's perfectly lined up down here, it's actually hanging over the edge of the line up here. It's also more accurate to cut with your ruler because there's a lot more helpful marks on here. So you can see there's the 1/2 inch lines, there's 1/4 inch lines, there's 1/8 inch lines, but your cutting mat is a whole different story. So you have your inches square here, but if you need to cut a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch, you have to come down to the bottom of your mat. Oh, let's scoot it down a little bit. If you want to use these lines and your short ruler, you can line up your 1/2 inch, sure, down here, but when you get up here, let's scoot my camera again, you don't have anything to line up with up here. You just have to sort of eyeball it. So that can lead to you cutting some not quite parallel lines. And the last really good reason to use your ruler to measure and not your mat is because over time, if you're using that same measurement over and over and over again on your mat, it's going to wear your mat out. I can't really show you that much on my own mat because I do use my ruler, and I often cut at an angle too. But over time, if you cut on the, say, like 10-inch line over and over and over again, you're going to start wearing out that specific place, and you're going to start getting fibers in there, and it's going to make it harder to cut, and it's going to be a nightmare. So use your ruler and move around your mat a little bit if you can. Don't always cut in the exact same place. So basically, my personal rule for the cutting mat lines is to just ignore them completely unless I'm cutting any piece of fabric that's 10 inches or bigger. In my opinion, the importance of accuracy is sort of a sliding scale. So the smaller your pieces are, the more accurate you want to cut. As the pieces get larger, it becomes just a little bit less important. I mean, it's not unimportant, but if you mess up a little bit, it's not going to show as much on a big piece as it will on a little piece. And I'm talking about simple traditional piecing here because when your blocks get more complicated, accuracy becomes very important again. Okay, let's cut the pieces for block 1. I'm going to consider my darker colors color 1 and my lighter colors color 2, but this is definitely something that you can decide for yourself based on how you're arranging your colors. I'm going to be using my ergonomic rotary cutter and my 12x6 ruler. There is a little bit of a difference when you're cutting if you're right-handed or left-handed. So let's start with right-handed because that's how I cut. We'll start there first. You're going to have your ruler on the left side, your rotary cutter in your right hand, and you're going to measure it this way. So say I'm cutting a 2-inch strip, I'm going to figure out where my 2 inches is, and then I'm going to move it over to this edge of the fabric. And remember, we're going to line up tip to tip on the pinked edge. So if I was making a 2-inch cut, I'd line up 2 inches, and then when I'm cutting, I'm going to start down below the fabric and put my rotary cutter there and place this edge flush against my rotary cutter. I don't want it next to it, I want it actually touching, and you can feel it when it's there. Then when I'm ready to make my cut, my rotary cutter is in place, I will put a little bit of pressure and follow the ruler up. At no point do I want to wiggle off or veer off of the ruler, so you want to go slow at first probably until you get used to cutting. And really make sure that your rotary cutter stays flush with your ruler. Now, if you are left-handed, you're going to do the process just in reverse. So if you're going to do 2 inches, you'll find your 2-inch line. You're going to line it up with the edge of your fabric. You're going to be holding your ruler down with your right hand and your rotary cutter with your left hand. And actually, this rotary cutter is right-handed, so I'm not going to use that one. I'll use this one instead. So, and when you use this one, I find it's more comfortable to hold like this than like this because I start to get wrist pain if I hold it like this. And it's much more comfortable to hold it like this and cut over time. But it's the same process. You want your blade to be flush against the ruler. Oops, I messed up my line. So you want your blade to be flush against the ruler, a little bit below the fabric, and then you'll apply that same pressure and follow. I'm trying not to make an actual cut right now. And so you'll have your blade flush against the ruler and then follow that up until you reach the end. And you're actually going to pass the edge of that fabric just to make sure you've gone all the way through. Okay, so let's see it in action. For block 1A, I'm going to make a 3-inch cut. So I'll find my 3-inch line right here. I'm going to align it to this edge because I'm right-handed. Now I'm ready to make my cut. And I'm going to put my rotary cutter flush against the ruler. Steady pressure, keeping the rotary cutter flush against the ruler. I think I need a new blade. Did you hear that sound? Oh yeah, I definitely do. Okay, so this is a good hint when you need to change your rotary blade, is when you have these little threads. That's all that's keeping the pieces together. So I need to change this before I make any more cuts. But first, the simplest way to deal with this is to just take your rotary blade, do a little press, and then you see it's released. I have to do that all the way along this cut. So this is not ideal, by the way, because you might notice there's a little bit of a bump there now, a little bit of fraying. So let me change this real quick. Okay, fresh blade, let's try this again. So I did my 3-inch strip, now I'm going to do 3.5 inches. I recommend every time you're about to make a cut, you double check that you have the measurement right, okay? Because sometimes I will be aiming for 3.5 and for some reason I stop here at 2.5. I make a cut and then I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I do that? So I want 3.5. I'm going to double check, 1, 2, 3.5. That's exactly what I want. I'm going to make sure that my line is flush with the fabric because I want those parallel lines. And then it's time to make a cut. So down below the edge of that fabric, everything is flush, the ruler and the rotary cutter. Make the cut, and then voila, perfect. Move that aside too. The last cut for this one is 2.5 and 1. So you can take your pick. Do you want to measure 1 inch or do you want to measure 2.5 inches? So let's do 1 just to make sure we get that 1 inch perfect and we don't accidentally make it too short. Get everything lined up to the best of my ability, and I'll show you how I use this one. Okay? Actually, I don't know how old this blade is either, so wish me luck. So I'm going to double check my 1 inch line. Yes, looks good. Everything looks all lined up. I'm going to put my rotary cutter down here below the line of the fabric. Apply light pressure and follow that all the way up the ruler. And there you go. So there are my first 4 pieces. And I'm going to stack them neatly together according to size. Set them aside. Now, before I start cutting number 2, let's talk about directional fabric. When you're looking at a piece of fabric and it clearly has a top and a bottom or a right side up, so obviously the hearts should be right side up, right? If they're like this, they're upside down. So that is a good way of telling if it's a directional fabric. If it appears like your pattern is moving in a specific direction, that's also a directional fabric. Or if you turn your fabric and the pattern is noticeably different, so maybe there's not an obvious up or down, but when you turn it to the side, it has a very noticeable difference, those are all directional fabrics. If you're like me, you're probably going to want to make sure you're being intentional when you're cutting directional fabrics. So for instance, we're cutting strips. So how do we want our strips to look? Do we want them to look like this, with the hearts going this way? And remember, the blocks are going to lay like this in the quilt. So your strip is going to look like that. So do you want your hearts going to the side, or do you want to cut them? You want to cut your strips like this so that the hearts are going up. And you might even have even more obviously directional fabrics with like faces and people and things, and you don't necessarily want them to be upside down or to the side. And maybe it doesn't even matter to you. So just do what feels right, but keep in mind that directional fabrics can really change based on how you cut them. So for color 2, our first cut is going to be 2 inches wide. So I'm aligning my 2 inches along the tops of those points like it's one solid line. And actually, my block is just the tiniest bit out of shape, so I'm going to have some pieces peeking out in the middle here. So my rotary cutter is below my fabric, flush to the rotary cutter. I'm going to apply even pressure and keep those 2 things touching all the way up. The second piece is 1.5 inches. Going to line up the sides the best I can. I'm going to double check 1.5, so that's the right size. Rotary cutter below the fabric, touching the ruler. Even pressure, keeping them both touching the whole time. There's my cut. For the last cut, again, I can choose to cut a 3-inch or a 3.5 inch. And I'm going to go with 3.5 because I like to use my thinner dotted lines on my ruler as much as possible because I feel like that's the most accurate line I can use because you can see through it and it's so fine. So I've lined it up on the side, 1, 2, 3.5. Rotary cutter down below the fabric, touching the ruler, gentle pressure all the way up. So there I have cut all the pieces for my first block. And at this point, it might just be fun to just move them around a bit and see what they look like together, whether you're following the pattern or not, just to get an idea of what your blocks might look like. When it comes to cutting your blocks, you can cut all your fabric all at once, get it all out of the way, or you can do something called batching, where you do small batches at a time over a longer period of time. And this is going to come down to your own personal preference. There is no right or wrong way to do this. Some people like to get all of their cutting done all at once, get it all out of the way, and then other people might like to mix it up a little bit more. They'll do a little cutting, they'll do a little sewing, do a little pressing, and then start over with cutting, sewing, pressing, and so on until they've finished all their blocks. I personally like to batch cut because my wrist gets sore if I do too much cutting at once. I've had problems with that before. So I know that I like to do little pieces at a time, go easy on my wrist. And also, when I was still a new quilter, I cut everything I needed, all the fabric I needed for a quilt, and I didn't realize until I started sewing that I had made a catastrophic cutting mistake that made it completely unusable. So ever since I made that mistake, I have always made practice blocks. So I don't necessarily like this combination of fabric. It's just what I had in my scrap bin, and I cut it up and sewed it together just to get a feel for the block. And you can do this too if you want, because we're only using 40 squares from our layer cake for this pattern. You're going to have 2 leftover pieces. So you can use this piece to practice cutting, you can use it to practice your sewing, you can use it to practice your pressing, and you can even, if you have leftover batting and backing later on, you can make a little practice quilt. So you can practice your quilting. So these are 2 very valuable pieces of fabric. They can teach you a lot, so don't throw them away. Keep them handy. Whenever you're feeling stressed about trying something new, or if you don't feel like you quite know what you're doing yet, you can use these. If you make a mistake, don't be discouraged. It is part of the learning process. It's frustrating, but it's part of it. And even experienced quilters still make cutting mistakes. Now, whether or not you cut everything all at once or split it up into tiny batches, you're going to want to make an effort to stay organized. You want to make sure that the pieces of your block don't get separated or lost or mixed up from one block to another. And there are so many ways to do this. I think quilters are very creative and they come up with lots of different methods that are just perfect for them, so I'm sure you will too. But I'll give you a couple suggestions on the things that I like to use. My favorite way to label is with scrap paper because I just have scrap paper everywhere, so it's just a really natural way for me to label. And you can make your labels bigger if you want to add tons of detail. So, for instance, I'm just doing block 1, 2, 3, and 4. But if you wanted to be more specific, if you have a very detailed plan in your head on how you want to lay out your blocks, you could write down block number 1, second column, 4th block down, or whatever detail that you need to know to keep it all organized and separate in your head. Another thing you can use that you probably have just laying around is some tape. I think, is this called masking tape? I'm drawing a blank. You can rip it off and stick it down and write on it. You can write on it, write on the roll, and then rip it off. However you want to do it. And you can, again, be as detailed or vague as you want to be when you're using this. And there's a ton of it. It's going to last a long time. You could go as far as to label every single strip in your block, but I think it's pretty easy to tell which size is which. If you think you're going to have trouble telling the strips apart, you can use these labels and put like A, B, C, D, and then stick them on to each individual strip. So obviously the stickers and the tape is going to stick onto the fabric itself. You don't need anything to hold it down. But for the paper, I really like to use my clips, my quilter clips. They're really easy to use, and you don't have the potential of accidentally poking yourself with, like you would with a pin or a safety pin. But if you have a ton of these laying around, by all means, use them however you would like. I've also seen quilters use Ziplocs and cookie sheets and different kinds of cardboard and, you know, just anything that they have readily available in a great quantity, they'll repurpose to help organize. You can also do something that I call a fabric lasagna. So you'll put down a piece of paper, you'll write any of the information that you need to write, like what block it is, any pertinent information. Then you'll put your fabric on top, then you'll do another layer of paper, and that paper will have some kind of labeling on it. Put your fabric down, and then another piece of paper, and so on. The fabric lasagna does work pretty well, but it is really better if you're batching small quantities at a time, or else your lasagna will get too tall and it will fall over and make a mess, and then all of your organization is out the window. So your homework now to be ready for the next video is to cut out all of your blocks, whether you do it a little bit at a time or everything all at once. Because next video, we're going to finally do some sewing, and we're going to talk about the 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm so excited. We get to finally start sewing. I love sewing. I want to get some blocks done. Thanks for spending time with me today, quilters. If you want to support this channel and help me buy supplies and materials for future videos, please visit my Buy Me a Coffee page linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss upcoming videos. And I'll see you again real soon. Bye!